사집단 난다 사집단 난다 사집단 난다 사집단 난다 낮에
earlier today, tonight, Barb asked, "Are you looking for the desert?" Meaning this book. And I said, "Yes, I'm looking for the desert." I think in a real sense, a lot of people these days are looking for the desert. You know, I mean, meaning a place that is quiet, a place that is a time to reflect. You know, scorpions notwithstanding, desert is a place I think we all need, understood as a time and a place of quiet, prayer, reflection. And I can't help but think more and more that, and Merton hints at this in his writings, he kind of secretly suggests that perhaps someday there will be a movement that will renew the monastic world. Because like the Christian churches, most Christian monasteries are declining right now. And I just think it would be such a positive thing that more and more places could be devoted to quiet, reflection, prayer, you know, the essentials that make up a monastic community. And,
There's another aspect of it for me, and that is that it's a place where I don't have to interact with the world system on its terms.
right, and that was huge for the early desert dwellers.
Yeah.
They intentionally left that.
And it
World.
just lets you relax in a way
Right.
you can't explain when you have a 9 to 5.
Right.
And,
Right.
you know.
Yeah, yeah. And we are getting, little by little, more and more people expressing interest in that. And sometimes you don't know what that is until you're in it. And then when you're in it, you don't want it. But at least I think there's a growing interest. And I can't help but think, especially today, now, given our social political environment, which seems fraught with anxiety, that places like this, devoted to prayer, silence, quiet, meditation, and away from the madness of the 9 to 5, are going to become more and more needed and more populated and helpful. I guess that's the key point, that it can be helpful, even healing. So we'll carry on with Thomas Merton tonight in his introduction. I can't remember exactly where we left off. Does anybody remember?
Towards the end of the introduction.
What's that?
I think it was towards the end of the introduction.
Toward the end of the introduction. Okay, we'll start with this paragraph. We may have read this before, but won't kill us. What kind of life did these desert dwellers lead? What kind of life? A word of explanation may help us understand their sayings better. The desert fathers are usually referred to as abbot or abbas or elder. An abbot was not then, as now, a canonically elected person in the community, but any monk or hermit who had been tried by years in the desert. Merton really likes that, the trying by years in the desert. and proving himself a servant of God. With them, or near them, and this is interesting, it's a threefold structure. With them or near them lived brethren, quote unquote, and novices. Those who were still in the process, very much in the process, of learning the life. The novices still needed the continuous supervision of an elder and lived with one in order to be guided by his word and example. The brethren lived on their own, but occasionally resorted to a nearby elder for advice. So you see the structure.
Mm-hmm.
There's a hermit living alone, and then near them or with them would be the novices, and they would be regularly instructed and guided in terms of their lives. But then there were the brethren, quote unquote. So it was kind of a threefold structure that he's pointing out here. And the brethren, I'm guessing, could include families, people that lived nearby and would go to the desert father or mother and ask for a word, you know. And it kind of became a society in that sense. Now Merton doesn't speak about families, but from other stuff I've read, it's suggested that families did reside nearby, close enough to be able to pay the old grouchy guy a visit. Most of the characters represented in these sayings and stories are people who are, quote, on the way, unquote, on the way to purity of heart, rather than those who have fully arrived. The Desert Fathers, inspired by Clement and Origen and the Neoplatonic tradition, were sometimes confident that they could rise above all passion and become impervious to, these are the big ones here, anger, lust, pride, and all the rest. So, and then Merton's conclusion is this: but we find little in these sayings to encourage those who believed that Christian perfection was a matter of reality. The praise of monks beyond all passion. Okay. So what I hear him saying is that there were those who believed that they could rise above all human struggle, right? All human passion, anger, lust, pride, and all those things. And Merton is saying, yeah, right. There's no evidence of that. You know. But when a tourist would visit them, the tourist would go, oh, wow, they're so holy, you know, and then would go back to wherever and say, these people have overcome all these things, you know, but they didn't bother to check with those people to see if that's what they really believed. And Merton is saying it just wasn't a reality. They struggled just like everyone else. In fact, that's what made them so appealing, that they talked about their struggles, you know, kind of like in a good AA meeting. You know. So he goes on, the praise of monks beyond all passion seems indeed to have come from tourists who passed briefly through the desert and went home to write books about what they had seen. Hoo-ha! Rather than from those who had spent their whole life in the wilderness. Those who had spent their whole life in the wilderness were much more inclined to accept the common realities of life. So none of this esoteric crap, okay? None of this secret knowledge that sells books, you know, then and now. Merton says, no, that's nonsense. That's not what they were about. They were much more inclined to accept the common, everyday realities of life and be content with the ordinary lot of people who have to struggle all their life to overcome themselves. I mean, you know, So maybe that's one reason why monasteries are in decline is, that maybe it's not such a popular thing, to focus on overcoming yourself, get over yourself kind of a thing, in terms of an intense program. Maybe that's just not what people are into these days. He goes on. The wisdom of the sayings, I'm talking about the sayings of the desert fathers and mothers, the wisdom of these sayings is seen in the story of the monk called John. John began to boast that he was beyond all temptation. He didn't struggle. He had no serious interior problems, and was advised by a shrewd elder to pray to God for a few good, solid battles in order that his life might continue to be worth something. Can you imagine going to your counselor and therapist and you say, things are fine, I'm cool, I don't have any great struggles going on, I'm really cool, no problem, and your instructor says, pray that you can experience some real struggles. Then maybe you can have something of worth to offer. Next paragraph, or at certain times.
At certain times, all the solitaries and novices would come together for the liturgical synaxis, in parentheses, Mass and prayers in common. And after this, they might eat together and hold a kind of chapter meeting to discuss communal problems. Then they returned to their solitude, where they spent their time working and praying. They supported themselves by the labor of their hands, usually weaving baskets and mats out of palm leaves or reeds. These they sold in the nearby towns. There is sometimes question in the verba of matters relating to the work and to the commerce involved. Charity and hospitality were matters of top priority and took precedent over fasting and personal ascetic routines. The countless sayings which bear witness to this warm-hearted friendliness should be sufficient to take care of accusations that these men hated their own kind. Indeed, there was more real love, understanding, and kindliness in the desert than in the cities, where then as now it was every man for himself.
The fact is all the more important because the very essence of the Christian message is charity, unity in Christ. The Christian mystics of all ages sought and found not only the unification of their own being, not only union with God, but union with one another in the Spirit of God. To seek a union with God that would imply complete separation in spirit as well as in body from all the rest of mankind would be to a Christian saint not only absurd, but the very opposite of sanctity. Isolation in the self, inability to go out of oneself to others, would mean incapacity for any form of self-transcendence. To be thus the prisoner of one's own selfhood is, in fact, to be in hell, a truth that Sartre, though professing himself an atheist, has expressed in the most arresting fashion in his play No Exit.
All through the verbose synonym, we find a repeated instance in the primacy of love over everything else in the spiritual life, over knowledge, gnosis, asceticism, contemplation, solitude, prayer. Love, in fact, is the spiritual life, and without it, all other exercises of the spirit, however lofty, are emptied of content and become mere illusions. The more lofty they are, the more dangerous the illusion. Love, of course, means something much more than mere settlement, much more than token favors. Love means an interior and spiritual identification with one's brother, so that he is not regarded as an object to which one does good. The fact is that good done to another is to an object is of little or no spiritual value. Love takes one neighbor as one other self, and loves him with all the immense humility and discretion and reserve and reverence without which no one can presume to enter into the sanctuary of another subjectively. From such love, all authoritism, brutality, all exploitation, domineering, and condescension must necessarily be absent. The saints of the desert were enemies of every subtle or gross expedient by which the spiritual man contrives to bully those he thinks inferior to himself, thus gratifying his own ego. They had renounced everything that savored of punishment and revenge, however hidden it might be.
Thank you. Is that the end of the introduction?
No.
We got a little more to read tomorrow night?
Yeah, it was about 4.5 pages.
Oh, really? Okay. That's a long introduction.
Yeah.
Any thoughts?
It's a nicer picture than some of the ones I used to have of the, like the desert or hermit type people that were kind of ornery and didn't want regular folk hanging around them, you know. I'm not sure where I picked that up from other readings, but this is a nicer sense of those guys.
Mhm.
I like the description of that they were more loving in a real sense than the people in the cities. And I can see how that could be, because there's not distractions, but there is hardship. And when you have hardship, you gotta help each other. And you have to really care.
So, Thomas Merton, I don't know if he goes into it in this introduction or not, but he touches on it. He touches on the criticism of monastic life. You know, Tim, you mentioned it in saying a bunch of grumpy old men.
Mhm.
I think there was a movie called Grumpy Old Men, right?
Yeah.
Walter Matthau and
Jack Lemmon.
Jack Lemmon, yeah, grumpy old man. There's some truth to that, and there's stories, you know, about people trying to have conversations with these grumpy old men and
Yeah.
go away, leave me alone, you know. And I'm sure that happened. And there's another side to it. But the criticism of monastic life is twofold throughout history. One is this, that they were, you could call them grumpy old men, or more seriously, antisocial. Right? That they abandoned the city, they abandoned their responsibilities in life to retreat to a solitary existence where they focused on themselves. You know, that's a serious criticism, and it's one that, you know, every monk and member of the monastic community needs to consider, because that can happen. That motivation, that behavior can actually happen, and did, I'm sure. And so they were considered by many critics to be anti-culture. You know, they rejected the culture of the time. They rejected the city life, with all that meant. You know, the arts, music, concerts, you know, whatever, sporting events. You know, they were criticized for being antisocial, anti-culture. So that's the first criticism. The second criticism is among those who are already Christians, and Christians have criticized the monastic movement seriously, and especially starting in the 16th century with Martin Luther and the emerging Protestants. They would call the monastic movement unbiblical. Try and find the word monk in any place in the Bible. It just doesn't exist. Right? Now that's a superficial criticism. You also can't find, you know, the word can opener, you know? But that doesn't mean we don't use can openers, you know.
Yeah.
But the criticism, when it's taken seriously, it goes like something like this. There's nowhere in the scriptures where it tells people to withdraw from life as it is. There's no place that says, you know, you need to leave society and go off and be alone, you know, for the rest of your life. There's no place that speaks about that kind of reality, and I think that's true. However, there are texts in the New Testament, and some in the Old Testament, that suggest a kind of life that could evolve into a monastic life. For example, John the Baptist was, as far as we know, living a life like a monk, out in the wilderness. And just like with the desert fathers and mothers, he went out there and then people started gathering around him. Interesting. When it comes to celibacy and that life, there's nothing in the New Testament that says Jesus was sexually active. Okay. But it does, by its silence in that sense, suggest that he was celibate. I know there's some people that would love to say that he and Mary Magdalene got it on, but I think that says more about the people than about the text. And there's nothing, no evidence really to say. There's some writings later on that says, oh, they kissed. And I don't take that very seriously at all. So when it comes to the New Testament, the balance of it is living wherever you're living in the culture, not withdrawing from the culture. At the same time, there's these examples like John the Baptist and of course Jesus, who in a way lived a kind of monastic life. And there's other things as well, like when the Apostle Paul says in some of his letters, he says, so, sisters and brothers, what should we do? Should we marry? Should we get married? And he says, if you have to, yeah, but it's better to be single. Paul said that, right? No, some people don't like Paul, so they dismiss everything he says. That's a choice. But very quickly, and this is not in the New Testament, very quickly, people began to live a life that valued simplicity, celibacy, and service. And very quickly, they began to move out of the cities into what could be called wilderness or desert or countryside or something, and began to live a life of quiet solitude, prayer, simplicity, celibacy, service, and all those things. And that, within a couple centuries, became monastic communities. But I think it's important to acknowledge that there are serious criticisms of that movement, both by society, who considered monks antisocial. And by the way, some people claim that the Roman Empire fell because of the Christians. I don't know if you've heard that one before, but, because the Christians basically withdrew from military service in the first 3 centuries before Constantine. And there are some people who believe that that withdrawal, and even some of them refuse to pay taxes. Right? So when you have that kind of withdrawal from your responsibilities in a society, you affect that society, especially if it's en masse. You've got lots and lots of people doing it, and there were lots and lots of Christians withholding taxes and not serving in the military. So there's that criticism, that they affected society from a certain point of view in a negative way, right? Contributing to the collapse of the Roman Empire, which did collapse in the 5th century. So there's that, and then the other one is the criticism by Christians themselves, and that's a very strong one, which is one reason why Taizé was looked on skeptically at the beginning, because they were Protestants and they were monks, and those two just didn't go together for centuries. And it's a valid criticism. How can you be a Protestant and a monk? Monks are what those Catholics do the monk thing. Right? And, but Brother Rogers said, no, I think we can do it too. And it's going to be real, it's going to be humble, and it's going to be very focused, and we're going to do the traditional monastic thing. And that's what happened. So, any thoughts?
Yeah, those who criticize that movement, I wonder how they feel about the Exodus in Egypt.
Feel about what?
The Exodus of Egypt.
The Exodus from Egypt?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, well, there's a kind of leaving for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, leaving society in a big way. Yeah.
Which caused the collapse of another, but you know,
That's a
certain
good point,
societies
Michael.
still-
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that, but I think you're right, that the leaving of Egypt, a society, under the direction of Moses, under the direction of God, did contribute to serious problems in Egyptian society, and not to mention all those people that were drowned in the sea. But, yeah, and they were certainly considered antisocial at that point. Yeah.
Yeah, they were in those 40 years. So.
They were wandering for 40 years. Yeah.
I'm also remembering Jesus, for example, said things like, give to Caesar what's Caesar's. And he said, let the dead bury the dead. And that wasn't about dead, it was about people that kind of weren't alive in their heart. And he criticized the Pharisees, which is leadership. So I think that, maybe being people apart was part of what Jesus was leading to.
Yeah. And certainly when he called people to him, he called them out of,
Yeah,
like in the case of Matthew,
right.
their occupation, or
Yeah.
Peter and John, out of their occupation. They were fisher folk. He said, leave your nets behind, boys.
Yeah.
We're going to do some other kind of fishing.
He also said we weren't to worry about how we were going to eat the next day.
And
Or-
that's part of the
yeah.
madness of the society, no matter then or now, isn't it? The craziness, the worry,
Mhm.
the fear.
Yeah, not trusting God.
Yeah. So yeah, in a real way, the Jesus in the Gospels is calling people out of
Mm-hmm.
a certain way of being in that society into a new way of being, in a new kind of society, which we call the kingdom, I like to say, kingdom of God, K-I-N. And, yeah,
You know, the one place he says, those of you that leave your families and jobs and homes, and so he's, I mean, very much calling them out of societal living of that time. So I recall in the Old Testament, there were a number of crazy men that lived in the wild and would come into town and called prophets.
right.
But it seems to be a heartfelt thing.
Yeah.
In many cultures, the shaman go live outside of the town or village. It's like, to talk to God, you need time and space that
Yeah.
you can't get from downtown real easy.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, if you look at different faith traditions, right? For example, Hindu faith, the whole thing got started with some people leaving the society, going into the forest, in this case,
Yeah.
and hearing a call, hearing what later became the sacred scriptures of the Hindu faith, right? The Vedas. I mean, if you look at the beginning of Judaism, you've got Abraham leaving the society. I'm sure Sarah had a thing or two to say about that, and but he ventures off into wilderness. Moses, same thing. On man it goes. I mean, I'm remembering what little bit I remember about the Buddha, but he left
Mm-hmm.
a well-established role in society
Mhm.
Very well established, yeah.
and found a new way of life.
And he tried some of the current, in his time period, like the ascetics and what were some of there was like 2 or 3 different kinds of people that were looking for that depth, that awakening. And he tried them all before he went off and sat under the tree by himself.
Yeah.
I read that after his awakening, as he was getting going as a teacher, he'd often just go out somewhere, and then people would come and they'd have camp there for a while. And then usually the local people would throw him out because they were eating up everything. And it was, but so his was kind of a nomad
Right.
ministry for many years until he established a home base.
It's interesting, isn't it? When
Yeah.
you reflect on these different faith traditions. It seems that each one began with wilderness,
Yeah.
with aloneness, solitude, and then people gathered. But if there's a clear break in each case,
Yeah.
with the established society, the way things are done, and there's a leaving behind of that.
Yeah.
And I can't help but wish, I guess, that that's what's happening today. That more and more people are beginning to think, feel, and act to create a new kind of society. Because clearly the one we got right now is in trouble. And, that would be my hope. We'll close with a song. knowing what we know, seeing what we've seen. How shall we live, knowing what we know, seeing what we've seen? How shall we live, knowing what we know, seeing what we've seen? How shall we live, knowing what we know, seeing what we've seen? How shall we live, knowing what we know, seeing what we've seen? How shall we live, knowing what we know, seeing what we've seen? Then it changes. Where do we go? Where do we go from here? Where do we go? Where do we go from here? Where do we go? Where do we go from here? Where do we go? Where do we go from here? How shall we live, knowing what we know, seeing what we've seen? How shall we live, knowing what we know, seeing what we've seen? The close of this day, we give you thanks for your great love for the whole world and everyone in it. Give us eyes to see and ears to hear and hearts that are open to what your Holy Spirit is doing today in this world to bring about a transformation of love. May it be so.